Hello, everybody, and welcome to our new lecture presented to you by Dr. Nidal Mahmoud, a lecturer at the English Department, College of Education, Misan University. Yes, my dear students, we have a new lecture today, and it will be about Ted Hughes' poem Casualty. So, as usual, we start with the life of the poet and also some of his works and the characteristics of his poetry. So Ted Hughes, of course, was born in 1930 England, and he died in 1998 in London. And he's an English poet and whose most characteristic verse is without sentimentality, and which emphasize the cunning and savagery of animal life in harsh, sometimes distinctive lines. At Pembroke College, Cambridge, he found folklore and anthropology of a particular interest, concern which is reflected in a number of his poems. And in 1956, he married the American poet Sylvia Plath, and the couple, of course, moved to live in the United States in 1957. And the year that his first volume of verse, The Hawk in the Rain, was published, and also so many other works as it is mentioned here. Ted Hughes stopped writing poetry almost for nearly 3 years following Sylvia Plath's suicide in 1963. And the couple, of course, had separated the previous year, but thereafter he published with the volumes of poetry such as Widow, the Crow, and so many other works. His birthday letters, 1998, he addressed his relationship with the Plath after decades of silence as the executor of her estate. And Hughes, of course, edited and published several volumes of her work in the period 1965 and to 1980. But he was accused of censoring writings after he revealed that he had destroyed several journals that she had written before her suicide. Yes, here we have some of the qualities or characteristics of Ted Hughes' poetry. Actually, Ted Hughes' poetic style is original, and he is very much influenced by Hopkins, Dylan Thomas, and Sylvia Plath. His usual tendency is to use top vocabulary and put words together in an unusual combination. Of course, this is one of his characteristics, the features of his poetry. And consequently, readers are obliged to make a mental effort to get the meaning of the word combinations. But it doesn't mean that Hughes is incapable of using simple vocabulary or of putting words together in a simple combinations. So he has written poems in which the vocabulary is absolutely simple too. And also the use of alliteration, this is assonance, this is another characteristic, which is a frequent phenomenon in his poetry. And Hughes uses the device of alliteration, and he does not give us only an impression that he is deliberately using it for the sake of the effect. In this case, the use of alliteration seems not only to be spontaneous but inevitable. So the use also of repetitiveness and paradox, obscurity, ambiguity makes his poems rich in their stylistic outlook. And Ted Hughes is a British poet of the post-war era, and he is very much fond of using animal imagery. This is the most outstanding feature of his poetry. And he is called sometimes as the animal poet, which means that he put focus on the images that are related to the animal or animalistic imagery. For him, animal vitality is different from human beings, and he compares the vitality of nature projecting animals or animalistic imagery. He shows interest in animals like birds, like rabbits, and many other natural phenomena. And also he does not only give realistic description of the animals, but also builds up myths about these animals to enlarge and to impart certain status to them. And in this regard, he is a myth maker too. Basically, he is a poet of natural vitality, and nature in its pure form is raw. Yes, I'm going to read the poem, The Casualty by Ted Hughes. Farmers in the fields, housewives, behind the steamed windows, watch the burning aircraft across the blue sky float, as if a firefly and a spider fought. For above the trees between the washing hang out. They wait with interest for the evening news. But already in a bramble ditch, suddenly smashed stems twitch. In the stubble peasant is running every way in astonishment that hopes up, quizzical hesitant. Flattens ears and tears madly away with the rain warns. Some who saw fall smoke beacons, they jostle above, they bear down a sunbeam as if they expected there a snake in the gloom of the pampers, or a rare flower. See the grave of dead leaves heave suddenly here. It was a man fell out of the air alive. Here now his groans and senses groping, they trip the slum of weeds, leaves, papered coils they raise, a body that as the breeze touches it glows, branding their hands on his bones, now that he has no spine against heaped sheaves. They prop him up, arrange his limbs in order, open his eyes, then stand helpless as goats in a scene, melting in the August noon. The burned man barks closer, greater flesh and blood than their own. As suddenly the heart's beat shakes the body and the eye. Open wide childishly, sympathies fasten to the blood like flies. Here is no heart more open or large than a fish, than a fist clenched, and in there, holding a close complacency its most dear, uncrushable diamond, the tears of their eyes, too tender to let a break start to the lip of such horror, closer as mourners can, ready to share all that is undergone. Grimace, gasp, gesture of death, till they look down on the handkerchief at which his eye stares up. Yes, we come to the critical analysis of the poem The Casualty. The poem, of course, starts describing the sudden falling of a man or of the airplane into a thorny ditch, and many farmers and housewives, they came to watch the plane crash. And the poet, of course, here in the first part of the poem, or the first stanza, presents two types of people: the farmers who are supposed to be working out in the fields, and we have the housewives who are indoors. And they could see that tragic event. I mean, here all the people, the outside in the fields, and the women who are kept in their houses, they were able to see the tragic event with astonishment. And being indifferent, I mean, those people, they stood watching what happened in the sky, which the poet describes as a fight between a spider and firefly. And this image, of course, it is used metaphorically to indicate the large scale of that disastrous event. And the indoor women and the working farmers were unable to do anything because they were away from the domain of the disaster. Yes, the one interest, of course, that they had at that moment, they could show, of course, is that they're waiting for the evening to come and to convey or to show in the evening news the tragedy of the crashed plane. So, of course, he wants to say that all people, they are engaged in doing nothing, just they were astonished to see the that tragic event. I mean, the air, or the crashed airplane. Then in the second and the third stanzas, of course, The poet who is categorized as the animal poet. Here he describes the animals and how they were affected by that tragic disaster which happened suddenly. And then he presents different images concerning the animals. Of course, he wants to show us the reaction of these animals towards that tragic event. And also you can see the difference between the people and in the first stanza and their reaction to the plane. Okay, and also we have the animals, and he wants to show us the difference between the animals and a human being concerning their responses toward that disastrous event. Of course, the animals, their emotions toward that tragic event is different. They are more responsive and more emotional than the human beings who are or who seem to be indifferent. And they felt, of course, the animals here, they felt bewildered by what happened. And then he presents the image of the peasant, which looked around, and the hare jumped up, and the ran that he cried out of astonishment, which goes out to warn the others of the danger of what happened. So it was a part of its duty that to warn other animals what happened exactly, that's something very disastrous. So here the images of these animals, the poet, as if he wants to say that the animals, they are more responsive, yes, and their reaction toward that tragic event seems to be different from the one which is presented in the first part of the poem, which is related to, the reaction of a human being. So the animals are surprised by the sudden intrusion on their land. Yes, they were bewildered about what happened suddenly. And after the crash, there is a man who is still alive. The crowd of people, of course, they saw a man falling down from the sky, and he was in need of their help. The word here we have fall, it means, or symbolically, it is used to indicate the biblical story of Adam's fall from Eden. And this notion is emphasized by the image of the snake, which may refer to fall of Adam's morality. Yes, of course, we can read the image on different implications or levels, but all we can say that the disaster which happened all of a sudden here shows that only we have one of the survivors. He's a man, and maybe he's the pilot, and he was in a very bad condition. So the first and the second and the third stanzas of the poem show the impact of that disastrous event on human beings and also on nature, which is presented by the image of the animals. Then we move to the fourth and fifth stanzas. Here the poet describes the onlookers. The people who gathered around the man. They were helpless, and they stood with helplessness and inability to help the fatally injured man. And the man was in a terrible state, of course, and the people who gathered around him were unsure what to do or even where to find his body. They tried to prop him up against heaped sheaves. People tried to do their best in order to put, for example, his legs in order, arrange his limbs in order, and open his eyes, but their effort was in vain. And they could not do anything else, and so they stood helpless like ghosts. They showed a kind of sympathy and towards the man, and they were astonished to see the man's body changed by the rapid heartbeat. The man tried, of course, to regain his senses and to see what happened to him, and but this was impossible because, as I told you, that he was in a very bad and hard condition. So in the last two stanzas, the poet describes the state of the onlookers. He is very much concerned with describing the people around the man, not only the man who fell down but also the onlookers, I mean the people. They could do nothing and pretended to be affected by the sad situation of the man. They all played the role of mourners. They pretend to show their emotions, but what they were maybe interested in one thing, which was taking the details, the details of the event, and then later sharing the others. So they stood indifferent, and this is one of the themes that most of 20th century poets show concern for. Yes, that the indifference of humanity toward each other. This is one of the disastrous, yes, problematic issues for many of the 20th century poets. The poem, I think, is concerned with presenting the theme of indifference of humanity toward each other. And of course, Casualty is an elegy, which is set in the divided Northern Ireland of the 70s. The poem is concerned with describing the futility of war, because it was written at that time, and at the time of the wars, and how most of the poets, the people, particularly the young generation, were affected by the wars, the horrible reality of war. And this sense is actually presented in most of the literary works of the 20th century poets, and of course among those Ted Hughes in his poem Casualty. The poem describes the futility of war and self-inflicted suffering. Yes, and it also presents the idea of commercialization of tragedy. Yes, as presented here, the idea of the people who tried, or they are interested in one thing, which is how to convey a portrait, or to share the others in the evening news, what they have seen. So I think the poem, it has more than one idea, and of course it carries the sense of the young generation who felt lost after the first and the second world wars. I think, and also Ted Hughes, in fact, he witnessed both these the world wars, and he had experienced the horrible reality of these two wars.